Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
It's Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, as part of our series on vaccines, we focus on vaccine safety. Professor Dan Salmon is the director of the Institute for Vaccine Safety at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He joins Dr. Josh Sharfstein to talk about the science and oversight of vaccine safety in the United States and using new technologies to improve vaccine safety in the future. Let's listen.
Professor Dan Salmon, thank you so much for joining me today on Public Health on Call to talk about vaccine safety.
It's a pleasure, Dr. Sharfstein. Thank you.
I want to start with a question about the science of vaccine safety. You are the director of the Institute on Vaccine Safety at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. If you were explaining the science behind what you do, where would you start?
Well, a tremendous amount is done in vaccine safety from the time people think of developing a candidate vaccine and all the testing through animals and laboratory and clinical trials. And then a lot is done once a vaccine is licensed, once it's used in millions of people. So vaccine safety is a part of vaccine development and use across the full continuum, from the very beginning of the development of vaccines until ultimately they're used in millions of people.
Now, we think about the safety of drugs. We think about the safety of medical devices. What is unique about vaccine safety?
Yeah, so vaccine safety is incredibly important. I mean, it's important for drugs as well. But in the case of vaccines, they're given usually for prevention, not for treatment like a drug. So you're dealing with healthy people. So therefore, your tolerance for risk or adverse reactions is much lower. And you don't really know who will, in fact, be infected and who won't, nor who will have severe disease. So for all those reasons, the standards for vaccine safety are higher than drug safety. Also, vaccines are often used almost universally. So almost everyone will get a vaccine, or that's the intended population, maybe almost all children or all adults, or it may be even a vaccine you get every year or multiple times. So even a rare adverse reaction, even a very rare adverse reaction, can impact a large number of people because so many people get vaccinated. So drug safety is obviously very important, and the standards for vaccines are even higher.
So the fact that so many people get vaccines, so many healthy people, really emphasizes the importance of safety. I also wonder whether if everyone's getting a vaccine, that makes it harder to assess whether or not there's a problem with safety in some ways, because, everyone's getting them and things might happen after a vaccination.
Well, it makes it both harder and easier in different ways. It's harder because if a drug is only given to a certain subpopulation, maybe people that have a certain medical condition that are of a certain age or certain comorbidities, you have a single defined population you need to study it in. Whereas in vaccines, if they're given universally, you have the whole population that includes many subpopulations. So in that way, it's harder. On the other hand, when we do epidemiological studies, obviously having more people to study a product in, it makes it easier in some ways as well.
How do you address people's concerns, or how do you think about the concern that I had a vaccine and 2 days later something happened to me?
Yeah, so this is probably one of the biggest challenges in vaccine safety science. Bad things happen to people every day, right? People get into car accidents and have all sorts of diseases, and bad things happen every day. And if you vaccinate a large number of people by chance alone, bad things will happen after getting the vaccine. So in vaccine safety science, we need to figure out if it's causal or if it's coincidental, Now, I mentioned a car crash. Well, most people wouldn't think a car crash would be caused by a vaccine. But for a lot of diseases, we don't fully understand the etiology. We don't understand the causes. So when people get vaccinated and then something bad happens to them, a medical condition where we don't necessarily understand the cause, it's very easy to attribute vaccination. And at the end of the day, we need to figure out, is it causal or is it coincidental?
So talk to me about the science of figuring out whether a particular concern is actually related to vaccination.
Well, clinical trials are great. The large phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials that are done before authorization or licensure are amazing because they're randomized and they're blinded. And randomization is just an amazing thing for causal inference. You know, if you see something higher in a randomized trial, you're much more able to say this is caused by, let's just say, the vaccine. But clinical trials have limitations, even very large ones, like vaccines are typically in the tens of thousands, about 40,000 for COVID vaccines. It's really large. But if you're talking about something that's rare or happens in a subpopulation or has a delayed onset, you're just not going to find that in a clinical trial. So what we're left with are large observational studies when millions of people are vaccinated. And those studies are much more complicated because there's often differences in who got the vaccine and who didn't get the vaccine. It makes causal inference more difficult. But ultimately, that's what we do for vaccines once they're licensed and used widely, is we look at what happens in the real world.
So talk to me about how the United States oversees vaccine safety.
Well, a lot of it is separated before and after a product is licensed and authorized. I mean, for vaccine development, ultimately it's the FDA that decides whether or not to license or authorize a vaccine. And they do so with the input of their advisory committee, VRBPAC. And that's really the pre-licensure piece. It's really largely on the FDA. Once a vaccine is authorized or licensed, the responsibility is more shared. A lot of it's done by CDC. CDC and FDA co-manage a passive surveillance system called VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. Anybody can report anything to VAERS. Usually you can't tell if it's truly causal or coincidental, with very, very rare exceptions, but it's an early warning system. And then we also have large healthcare databases that are used to try to separate fact from fiction or causal from coincidental. The largest and, well, the one that's been used most widely is a CDC project, the Vaccine Safety Data Link. It's large managed care, Kaiser type organizations. So you have great data. You have inpatient, outpatient, pharmacy, laboratory, pretty much everything you would need. There's other closed healthcare systems the government has, Indian Health Service, CMS, the VA, the Department of Defense. And then the FDA has a system called BEST, where they use health insurance companies to try to do the same thing. So it's a bunch of different systems. Those are the primary systems. You also have vSafe at CDC that was developed through COVID, where essentially you text people who've been vaccinated and you can go back to them and ask what's happened. And you have a project called CISA, Clinical Immunization Safety Assessment Centers. Here at Hopkins, we have one such center. And there's about a half a dozen of them. Their goal is to really try to understand the pathophysiology, subpopulations that increase risk of adverse reactions. So it's a pretty complex system. General, before licensure, it's FDA. After licensure, it's largely CDC. But other agencies also have assets in that space.
Sounds like, first of all, safety is particularly important for vaccines, but it also sounds like there's a lot more done investigating safety for vaccines than the typical drug or device. Would that be fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. I mean, I'm not an expert on drug safety, but these multiple systems through multiple agencies, the speed of data, I think is stronger for vaccines than for most drugs for the reasons we discussed. It needs to be.
Yeah. So we've heard about concerns that have lingered over the years that childhood vaccines could cause autism. As an expert in vaccine safety science, how have you thought about that allegation?
Well, so first, it's one of those things, like I mentioned before, where we don't fully understand the etiology of autism. So this is something that affects a large number of people. The incidence seems to be increasing, though it's not entirely clear if all of that increase is actually more people with autism or changes in how it's diagnosed and how it's treated. It's pretty complicated, but we don't really understand the causes, and it's probably plural. There's more than one cause. So it's one of those outcomes where people are suspect. People are looking for what the cause might be. But at this point, we've had 16 well-conducted epidemiological studies. And I'm emphasizing well-conducted because there's a lot of junk science out there. But there's been 16 well-conducted studies done by different investigators using different methods in different countries. And all 16 of them find no association between vaccines and autism. So I think the evidence, at this point is pretty compelling. But, that's not to say it's very hard in science to prove a negative. So you have to look at the weight of evidence. And the weight of evidence clearly does not show an association between vaccines and autism.
I want to pivot to the future and how vaccine safety efforts could be strengthened even further in the United States. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think we're really at a point where we have huge opportunities, and in two spaces in particular. One is the capacity to do large healthcare database studies. And secondly, to understand among whom and how and why vaccine adverse reactions happen. And let me talk about each of those for just a minute. If you look at, for example, the vaccine safety data link I mentioned, it's great data. It's about 3% of the US population, I think roughly 11 million people. So that's pretty big. However, often when you look at safety issues, you have to look at certain subpopulations, like take myocarditis post-mRNA COVID vaccines. The risk is different by both age and gender. So when you start cutting up that 11 million by age and gender, it's not as big as one would like. And with the growth of electronic health records and large databases, both domestically and globally, we have the capacity to really have a lot more data, some of which is very high quality. So if you take the myocarditis example, we have a global study looking at myocarditis and pericarditis post-COVID vaccines in a dozen different countries. So there's huge opportunities there, both domestically and globally, when we can combine data.
And so when you have more data, you can make more precise and accurate estimates of risks of potential adverse effects.
That's right. You can also do it much more quickly. And, size translates to speed, and therefore size matters. Eventually the VSD might be able to give you a great answer, but timeliness is really important in vaccine safety. So by having bigger, you may have better quality studies, but you may also get answers a lot quicker, which is super important. The other place where I see huge opportunities is to understand when vaccine adverse reactions happen, why they happen, and among whom. And in most diseases, we've had an increase in our understanding of the pathophysiology of the disease, and we're now able to do genomic studies. So if you take an uncommon adverse reaction, whether it be myocarditis after COVID vaccine or Guillain-Barré after a flu vaccine, historically, we've really struggled to understand those adverse reactions and why they happen, and among whom. If you take Guillain-Barré, maybe it's 1 to 3 cases per million people. So maybe that's just a random event. It's probably not. It may be the person's genome. And if we can figure out the how and why it happens, maybe we can make safer vaccines. Maybe that can inform vaccine development. Or we can screen those people and contraindicate the vaccine and prevent the adverse reaction all the time, altogether. So that's really where we have, as I see it, huge opportunities in advancements in science and big data to really take it to the next level in vaccine safety science.
Yeah, it's interesting that sometimes when you say we can take vaccine safety science to the next level, people wonder whether that means vaccines are not safe. How would you respond to that?
I see it as a continuous quality improvement approach. We can do the best with the tools and the resources we have today. And tomorrow we have new tools, new opportunities. And one always wants to make a system better and to improve it. So as we make improvements in big data and science and genomics, we want to take advantage of that. Now, wouldn't it be great if we understand genomics as we did today 10 years ago? Well, that would have been great, but we didn't. So we take advantage of what science we have today.
Well, Professor Dan Salmon, thank you so much for joining me today on Public Health on Call.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Cesiri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Cesiri. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.